This is an important discussion. Before we get started and before I introduce the panelists, I want to tell you all a little story because, well, that's what journalists do. I have actually interviewed a robot. When I was working at the Wall Street Journal, I interviewed a robot, a Canadian robot. Do you guys all remember Hitchbot? The robot that traveled across Canada. And, well, Hitchbot was very interesting to interview. At one point, I think Hitchbot got the impression I was making fun of their artificial intelligence because the response to my question was, "Are you not capable of making intelligent conversation?" It was a very colorful and exciting interview. And so the reason I bring this up is because the point of that experiment, if you talk to the developers, was, you know, we hear a lot about whether humans can trust robots, but that experiment was designed to find out if robots could trust humans. And so that dynamic, that interplay between humans and robots is, you know, the subject of our discussion, but in particular what it means for jobs. And so we have a great panel here to discuss this very important topic. We've got Kaylee Thiessen, who is the economist with the research department at Unifor. We have right beside me Todd Dovell, Vice President, Advanced Manufacturing Innovation at Magna International. And of course, Ae-Jung Moon, who's the assistant professor who just spoke from McGill. My son is headed to McGill in September, so
Excellent.
I'm very, very excited about that. Before we get started, just one disclosure item for me, because, you know, transparency is very important. I am a dues-paying member of Unifor. The Globe and Mail is a Unifor workplace. And until very recently, I was a union's women's advocate in the Globe and Mail news workplace. So I just wanted to make sure that that was out there. And of course, the other thing I wanted to say is if anyone's interested in the Globe's policy on AI, it is a public-facing document. It's on our website. You can learn more about how it is being used. I do not use AI in my journalism. I just want to make that very clear. You know, robots cannot yet accept brown envelopes from people, so, or maybe they will one day soon. Okay, let's jump into this discussion. We already know the potential friction points between employers and unions on this issue. There are worries about job losses, negative impacts on wages, workplace safety, and workers' rights. But we're really hoping to push the conversation forward today, especially given the productivity challenge that we're facing in Canada that we talked about this morning. So let's get started with the first question. Automation and robotics are poised to feature prominently in collective bargaining with employers across the country. It's already come up at our workplace, as I mentioned. Kaylee, let's start with you. How are unions like Unifor thinking about this issue?
There's so many ways to answer that question. There's so many different unions. There's so many different workplaces. I think the main point to drive across is that we all see it as a double-edged sword. No one's saying that technological progress is like the worst thing that ever happened to anyone. But there are very negative consequences that happen if we don't consider what the risks are and how to mitigate them. So the first point to make is that we're looking at technological change as a double-edged sword. Perhaps there's more jobs, perhaps there's higher productivity, perhaps we see an increase in pay. There are also all sorts of things that can happen that destroy a job or force people to move. There's all kinds of different things. I have a list of risks that we ask our local unions to look at when they are in collective bargaining, when they've been informed by their employer that they're introducing new technology. Ideally, they would actually be asked to be a part of the process of designing and implementing new technology, not just kind of have something imposed on them. So I'm gonna just make sure I cover everything. There's 7 ways that workers are impacted by technological change. Some of them we've already gone over. The first is job loss. You could also be displaced or you could experience like pretty significant estrangement from your job if it's really dramatically changed as a result of technological change. I think of folks who work in a manufacturing plant and they paint. So they used to be a painter who actually held the spray gun and they're painting, say, a beautiful logo on an aircraft. Now they've been replaced by a robot. They're actually working in inside the factory and they're running the robot. Their job is safer. They probably make more money because they're painting planes faster. But they used to think of themselves as an artist, and now they've lost this bit of their identity. Is that a reason to not automate? I think that's a question for someone else. But it is like something that happens in the psyche of a worker as that job is changing. There's also a change in work organization and required skills. Hopefully, if you're automating, you are providing those new skills and teaching those new skills to the workers that exist so they have the opportunity to be continuing in their job. Technology can also automate the way a person is managed, so you don't actually have a human manager anymore, you have an automated manager. How are those decisions decided? If they're really opaque, it means how are we supposed to trust that system if we don't actually know what that system is? We've talked about productivity today. When it comes to a worker, productivity looks very different than a balance sheet, productivity on a balance sheet. So have we actually improved the productivity of an individual worker, or have we increased their workload? And that means then they're just working faster and not necessarily that their productivity has increased or that the technology has changed that much for them in their experience. Number 4 is surveillance. If you think about truck drivers who have AI cameras that are now set to be just like staring at them all day long and automatically reporting every single movement that they make. Did you press the brake a little too hard? Do you get like docked points in some sort of system for that? And why did you press the brake too hard? Did a rabbit or a deer run out in front of you, or like a car in front of you brake really hard? Those sorts of decisions need to be transparent, but also understand the additional stress that puts on a person who's working on a regular basis. Health and safety and ergonomics goes both ways. We see this happen a lot where some jobs become a lot safer and some actually become more dangerous. We talk about the ones that become safer, but not the ones that become more dangerous. We need to remember that it's both. Pay and job security can be improved. That happens regularly, but they can also be suppressed. So we can't just tell one side of that story. And you can't think of jobs that are, say, undervalued, or but lots of society talks about low-skilled workers. It's actually a job that we've undervalued that we think requires no skill. We need to be making sure that we're recognizing that those folks are skilled, they have the ability to learn and adapt and grow into other jobs. And then, of course, there's bias that's overlaid over all of those things that pushes people in one direction or the other. That was a lot longer than I intended, but I want to make sure we have that baseline. So that's how we're thinking about it at Unifor.
Okay, so Kayla, I'm going to stay with you just for one second, because just as a follow-up, are there other opportunities to reach consensus between unions and employers outside of the collective bargaining process?
There's lots of workers who are not unionized. So how do you have a conversation in a non-unionized environment? Is there a structure that you have in order to have those conversations? I don't know. In a unionized environment, we're putting language inside a collective agreement that says we will have a conversation together. If you're going to automate certain things, any sort of technological change that will be introduced requires a certain amount of notification, and then a decision-making table that figures out how to mitigate all those risks that I just mentioned. In the Canada Labour Code, there is a requirement that workers are notified of technological change about 120 days, or maybe it's 90 days in advance, and that could be something that's replicated across. But that's like the bare minimum. The conversation is really what needs to happen.
Okay, Ajahn, I wanted to talk about some of the broader societal implications of these technologies. What do you see?
I think there's so many things we can talk about, and Kaylee's kind of getting me to think as well. In automating, especially within robotics, we like to think about these robots taking particular operations that may be very manual or human heavy and then automating it. As a human-robot interaction researcher, the classical example that I go to is cobots, collaborative robots that you do collaborative assembly with, and so on and so forth. But in many of these examples, and more of the service industry examples that are coming out the fore as well, I think we tend to have this assumption that some big tech, some person or people with deep pockets will be the only ones that will actually buy a whole bunch of them and then disrupt the entire ways in which things are done, and they'll be collecting a lot of the profit out of that. From people who may be building the robots and wanting to sell to those particular clientele, I understand the reasons for it. But then I think we're missing out on the opportunity aspect of it, where maybe if we start to look at smaller actors, maybe even taxi drivers, autonomous taxis, instead of thinking that big tech companies will have fleets of autonomous cars to run their taxi services, if individual taxi drivers can be owners of a fleet of them, small fleet of them, and then change the ways in which they were in this taxi industry, then we can start to think about ways in which automation is changing the inequality problems, not only in Canada, but across the world as well. So I see the centralization of the profit or the business models actually having a big impact based on the kind of stories that we tell ourselves when we introduce robotics into either service or manufacturing or other industries. Yeah.
So one of your areas of specialty is robot ethics. What is your advice to companies on how to think about that issue?
I think it really has to be highly contextual. Ways in which we've seen the most successful ways to think about ethical issues is really actually engaging the people who will be implicated. Typically, in the AI ethics world, where I also do some research as well, we tend to say, okay, we want to develop this cool tech that is fair, transparent, accountable, and all these kind of buzzwords. But then when you get down to the details of what they mean in developing ethical technology for a particular context, it's actually really tricky. And you can't do that without engaging the stakeholders who would be implicated in it and unpacking what does fairness mean to this particular worker? What does fairness mean for the data scientists, roboticists, and so forth? So I would say the number one key takeaway for anyone who worries about ethical implications in rolling out robotic solutions is actually hire people who can listen and unpack some values and convert it into real roadmap for your robotics project. Because otherwise, I think the adoption or deployment will actually have a lot more hiccups than you might imagine.
Todd, this is where we bring you into the conversation because I'd like you to address, from your experience, what are some best practices to engage with workers in plants about robotics and automation?
Yeah, so I think touching on some of the points already made, I think what you don't want to do is sort of show up on the plant floor, you've not talked to anybody, these strange people come in and sort of disrupt the work cell, nobody knows why they're there, and you just ask a whole bunch of really silly questions and sort of come back and sort of completely separating that function, right? For a whole bunch of reasons, right, it's best to engage early, right, to sort of engage with the experts, and I'll say experts because sometimes what we think of as low-skilled workers isn't really. I don't know I've found a job anywhere that doesn't have skill, right? There's expertise that comes into these things, and I don't know how many times I've seen processes developed for assembly or something else by a team of engineers and simulation, and you go in and you drop it with some operators who've been doing this for a while, and they come back with something completely different and far better within a matter of hours, right? So there is capability and knowledge. So there's a reason to engage earlier. It's advantageous from that reason, but sort of as, or even more importantly, right, is this, like, what's a barrier to bringing in robotics or any other form of automation, or actually any change into a manufacturing environment? It's fear, right? It's people have a fear, and it's not just a fear of, okay, my job might get displaced. There's also this pride or this fear that, okay, I'm really good at this job and this function, and you're going to take away this piece that I'm good at and I appreciate. So you kind of have to deal with that very early, right? Explain, okay, this is why we're coming in. It has to be overall, we're trying to improve this for a bunch of reasons. We're trying to secure our operations and everyone's employment, et cetera. This is how we go about it. And you're a key part of this, right? And we need those stakeholders, and not just operators, but it could be technicians, management. You need that cross-functional team. So I guess coming back to that, what's the summary? It's the cross-functional team, it's communication, it's listening to those voices, and a lot of listening, right?
And in our prep call, and people today actually have talked about this follow-up issue, which is the idea of using robots as tools rather than as replacements, direct replacements for people. What are some best practices that companies can employ when it comes to that issue?
So, yeah, that's a good point. I know some people talk about like lights out operations, et cetera. I tend not to think that way because, okay, there are some processes, especially hazardous ones, where maybe you want to pull people out completely. But what I've seen and experienced is most things aren't like that. Most things work better in a more collaborative environment where you think about traditionally we think about these closed cells, and we talked about it before, sort of light curtains and safety, and it's an isolated thing. I think there's enormous opportunity to look at things more collaboratively, to break down those walls, and how do I use robotics automation technology coupled with what people are really good at, right? If you take, okay, this bending over and picking something up is probably very hard on somebody and not really a high value thing for a person to be doing, but they may be doing an inspection, or there may be an assembly task that, okay, now that requires some skill and technique. How do I let them focus more on that and have, say, a robot or automation to take the more difficult part? So often it's not replacing a direct task. It's looking more systematically at a series of tasks and functions, and how you may have to reorganize that and change it to optimize.
Okay, so improving safety is obviously one area of common ground between employers and unions, but let's look at some other area that is kind of fertile common ground between these two stakeholders when we think about implementing robotics in the workplace. Kaylee, how can we ensure that Canadian businesses and workers receive the most benefit from a push or a transition towards automation?
Conversation is, I think, one of the most important things, and it's the thing that we start with first. When do workers get notified that even technological change is being thought about? How do we make sure, like Todd was just talking about, the folks who actually have the expertise that are doing the work in the moment that you think looks easy and is unskilled probably actually requires very specific movements over and over again? How are those folks being engaged and being a part of the process? In the end, you could see the potential for everyone who was involved to be really proud of the technology that was developed, and that and then also the risks being mitigated, so people aren't just being fired and left to their own devices, but in fact they're all a part of a process that's lifting the company, making it more profitable, improving wages, all of those things, but it can't be an afterthought.
Okay, I actually want to get Jung and Todd's view on this too, because there are obviously, as Kaylee pointed out, obvious pitfalls that companies should avoid if they want to, prevent unnecessary labor tension in the workplace. What are your thoughts, both of you, on that topic?
I think there's a lot more work that we could be doing in better understanding how deployment of a robot in a particular workplace changes the way people behave and influence the ways in which people slow down, speed up, even without them knowing. There's ongoing research just to be able to unpack, the motions of the robot and behavioral and decisional influence that it's having. Not actually unpacking these new types of influence that may have safety implications, I think can be really, really dangerous. In the sense that if I were to be the evil person here, and then unbeknownst to you, speed up the production line, just so that you as a worker will not actually recognize that things are being sped up, but I know. And I know at the end of the day, things are getting done much faster. then we're actually violating the Canadian Labor Code because, well, the kind of safety discussions have to be had, but it also has to be visible for the workers to be engaged, to have, okay, hey, I have a safety concern because now I can see that this robot is changing the way I'm doing things. So there are subtle different kind of implications from human-robot interaction research that we are starting to unpack, but it is not a close-ended research topic at the moment.
So thinking about, I guess, ethics and the interaction with robotics in the industry. So an example was given earlier around sort of monitoring a driver or something else like that. And okay, there's probably issues, especially in Europe, and sort of we work a lot in Europe, and you probably don't do that kind of thing at all anyway. But there's technologies and automation like that, and I would contrast them to things that are maybe far more positive. And when I look at a technology that's more, and I'll give an example of a camera system and a projector system and an intelligence system that monitors a workstation, not a person. It's monitoring the work itself and is providing guidance and help. Okay, and when you bring that to the shop floor, it has sort of dramatic improvements in sort of quality and throughput and all of those things, but generally the operators will actually really embrace that kind of thing and perhaps participate in creating it and building it. So I'd sort of go between those two things as opposed to, it's sort of a carrot and a stick, right? If you come at it from the aid side, it tends to work a lot better, and it's obviously embraced.
There's so many things to say. So and another piece of this puzzle is just to remember that when it may not be you folks that are introducing the technology, right? It's management on a shop floor or a customer service floor or any of those things. And the person you're talking to is a human who has human reactions and a life that they're trying to figure out how to, just like you do. And if you drop information and then you're just like, well, we're either going to close everything down and you won't have a job, or you have to do this. There's just a very different way to have that conversation. I don't know what kind of conversation styles anyone in this room has, but there are lots of companies where that interaction is very challenging. And then the other thing is, it's something we haven't talked about today, is that there are public policies that we could be also chatting about that are countrywide. If we're going to have this massive transition that we keep talking about to more automation, people doing higher skilled jobs, where is the training for that coming from? Is it just at an individual company? And there's lots of places where individual companies need to invest in training of workers and on-the-job training. But we could also be talking about a just transition that is way beyond just energy workers, but in fact looking at workers more broadly. If you're being transitioned, you're losing your job because of new technology, where are you going next? How do you figure out where you're going next? One of the things that works so well in Denmark is that there is a system for that kind of conversation, and it's one reason why then labor representatives are A, more willing to have the conversation, but B, that double-edged sword that I talked about, some of the sharpness of the negative side is dulled. And that's a really important part of the conversation as well, that we're making sure people have stability. Does everyone like change? We can all talk about whether or not we like it. But if some of the risks are mitigated, either at the company level or more broadly at the society level, then we can see more of those transitions happening in a way that hurts people less.
Okay, we're going to talk about public policy in just a second, but before we do, I want to engage in a little bit of myth busting first. What are some common misconceptions that people have about robot-enabled workplaces that you feel absolutely need to be addressed? I'm going to start with you, Todd.
Oh, okay. I think I sort of touched on it earlier, right? This idea that we're moving to this environment where everything's automated and robotic and end-to-end, and there's no people, and that's first of all, I think it's an illusion that that's even a good thing or something you want to go towards. But I also don't think it's really possible or the right way to approach at least much of our manufacturing. So that would be one.
Yeah, I think the narrative of robots taking away jobs and that's a bad thing, I think that's a bit of a myth. I've seen many examples where people actually really welcome technologies, and actually that led to more retention of labor in places where there is a high churn, just because of the fact that there is advanced technology in the workplace that actually makes the workplace itself more attractive for younger labor force as well. So I don't think we're having this kind of nuanced, detailed conversations when we say, there's another robot in a bubble tea shop and it's fully automated. Now there's no more bubble tea servers. I don't think it's that simple.
Definitely not that simple. I agree. I totally agree. And I think there's this misconception that everything has to be a fight when it can be a conversation, but workers really need to be brought into that conversation and also valued for the skill and the knowledge and the experience that they bring.
I was hoping that you would pick up on one of the other misconceptions that we discussed in our prep call, which is this view that only the big companies have use for robots, and maybe you could talk about that point.
Yeah, totally. I think maybe that's my academic hat on, but I do talk to small actors such as bakeries who are actually in the bakery industry because they're very passionate about baking, but they have a really hard time finding the staff who can be in the front of the cashier selling the croissants and pain au chocolat in the rush hours, because that's not the most interesting or the most fulfilling part of the baking industry. So do we have a problem there? Are they welcoming automation? Yeah, those smaller actors do come to research labs asking for automation for those kinds of operations as well. I don't think we have very easy solutions for them just because they are much smaller actors, but I think there is this conception that, okay, only the big guys will have the problems and the deep pockets to solve them. I think if we pay attention, we will see a lot more examples of smaller actors and their problems, and there are opportunities for robotics to offer solutions as well. It's a little bit trickier for the business end of angle of that, but yeah, at least from the research perspective, academia can actually help in that front, hopefully.
All right, how is this shift going to affect career pathways and professional development opportunities at work? Who wants to take that on?
I can start. I was interviewing some academics a few weeks ago talking about automation in the aerospace manufacturing sector. And one of the things that they mentioned is seeing kind of a bifurcation of skills requirements in a job. So if you have a large workforce and then a piece of the work is automated, you might get kind of siphoned or shuffled into a higher skill requirements, and you get higher pay, those sorts of things, or you're kind of shuffled into the lower end. But the pathway to get from the lower end to the higher end is now missing. It's been automated, and we don't understand what the pathway is anymore. And I'm not sure folks are necessarily having that conversation more broadly, but we need to be able to continue to provide that career ladder for folks that may be actually being cut off. That's one thing. And then the other piece that I've heard quite a bit is in the customer service area. A lot of what's being automated is actually maybe the work that was kind of enjoyable. And so a customer service representative is just stuck with the really, really crappy interactions with people who are really frustrated, really angry. You might be frustrated and angry with the system of automation that didn't work the way it was supposed to. And in the end, you're stuck having this conversation over and over again. And anything that was just helping a pleasant person get the service that they need has been eliminated. So automation has actually made your job a lot worse. And then in the meantime, you might have seen your pay decline or not go up as fast as others as well.
Any thoughts on what it means for career pathways?
I wonder how easy it is for people looking to gain more robotic skills who may be currently in whichever industries right now and actually looking to automate parts of the industry themselves or become a roboticist as a mature student, for example. I don't I don't think it's very easy to get into a university degree in your 40s and say, I'm going to be a roboticist. I also don't think Canadian universities make it very easy for anybody to say, okay, this is the university, this is the Bachelor of Robotics, this is exactly what I'm going to do, because we're so segregated in our departments and faculties, and say, are you looking for a computer science degree versus mechanical engineering degree versus and so on and so forth, where robotics, to me, is a problem-solving tool. It's a particular kind of technology that is very integrative, yet we don't actually teach it in this kind of integrated way. So I think we're missing this kind of a puzzle where if you already have your life experience and you're trying to add this extra bit of robotics talent, there should be more streamlined ways to get you there.
Yeah, I jump on that, right? I think that's really important. You know, we see this. We have a lot of education programs, but not nearly enough, right? And it's simple for the roboticist, someone who's going to do a PhD and postdoc, and okay, you know what that career path looks like. Their life is planned for their first 30 years or whatever. Okay, that's great. We need more of those folks. But what about the folks that, you know, they're maybe early or mid-career? We have very little way to bring them in, right? We can do it in industry somewhat because we have some flexibility, but it doesn't really connect into the accreditation and that side of things very easily, right?
Yeah, and just to add as well, I think we're kind of talking about conversations and engagement piece as well. We don't necessarily have hands-on kind of requirements for our engineering students to talk to our potential users and other stakeholders and actually understand what it is that these particular individuals are talking about and then translate that into design decisions. That's not really a part of the curriculum that we know how to teach formally.
The other piece I'd sort of add to that, right, Rita, is the technology shifts and it changes quite a bit. And what we think of as the industrial robotics industry of the past 10 years is changing significantly. You saw some of those examples today. I think that's a huge opportunity for like this group. If I think about researchers and Canadian industry, and we have a ton of talent and capability to help address that. And how do you make these technologies more accessible, ultimately, is what it comes down to, right?
To add to that, if we are going to see more people mid-career go back to school to try and learn a new career, we need to also be making sure that the income supports are in place so that people have stability in order to move into that next career. And that is public policy driven, which I know we're going to talk about in a few minutes.
Actually, we're going to talk about it right now because that's a good segue, because we have discussed and we've heard today from many speakers about how there's a risk of not having enough skilled workers in Canada, for this transition. And so I want us to have a public policy discussion right now. So given your druthers, I want you to, what would you ask the various levels of government for? And I want you to think very broadly about different facets of public policy: immigration, trade agreements, the income supports that you talked about, other aspects of the social safety net, perhaps which allow for unions to be stakeholders in places like Denmark, right? Things that maybe we don't have here. What's on your wish list?
Okay, the number one thing, well, the thing I'm going to start with, not that it's necessarily our number one goal, is that we need to have stakeholder tables where people from all different stakeholder groups are having input into a conversation that then government can design a full system. Right now we have politicians who are very polarized, but I don't think people are necessarily as polarized, especially if we're having conversations in person and not on social media. We're not nearly as polarized as we think we are, so we need to have those tables where we can collaborate to design the system that needs to be designed. I'll give you an example now of what we do when we have a plant closure, and there's been quite a few of those in the last year or so in Ontario in the auto sector. We start action centers. Those action centers are funded by employers and governments and then run by the union to help workers figure out what their next steps are. And they're peer driven. So it's a peer who you may have worked side by side with, like cutting foam for seats, for example. You come into the Action Center, they help you figure out what kind of testing you need. You can figure out then what skills you actually have. You've probably developed all kinds of skills in a 20-year career that are not listed in any sort of education. And then from there, we can help you decide whether or not you want to go back to school, or there is a job, say, somewhere that pays as much or more in your area. And that Action Center helps drive people to and supports people to make the decision that's best for them. On top of that, though, we would really like to see income supports and free tuition for all these folks that then are needing another job. And in other countries, that's something that's provided. Along with the income and the free tuition comes making sure you have health insurance and all the kind of wraparound things, childcare that you need in order to go through that stage of your life. Small things we need, small things.
I would love to see more government support, financially in particular, for financial incentives for all actors who are wanting to automate parts of their business, sort out this engagement piece, so that they don't have to go after, as a small bakery, okay, who can help me figure out what is the right path for my business? Who do I need to talk to? Who's going to be that third party who can do this kind of interviews and map out these values and design a roadmap for the roboticist to create a tailor-made solution for me? That particular piece of the puzzle is something that we don't really have a funding source for. If you were to hire me as a researcher, I probably won't publish anything in it. There's nothing academically interesting in it as a top-tier publication kind of a sense. From the industry perspective as well, unless you're already sold that we need this engagement piece up front, you probably won't know who to talk to. You probably won't pay for anything that is similar to that. So if there is a government requirement or funding incentives to make it happen, I think we'll have a lot more smoother transition for automation adoption.
I would go to a bit of a different area that came up, and as I was listening to Soren speak this morning, right? Classic cluster is what it looks like, at least what I understand, right? And at the end of the day, you have these large enterprises that emerge, and then that spins off all this value. And okay, so how does this happen? And what I look at, like what we have in Canada in particular, we have some really deep talent and capability in little bits and pieces. Some of them connect, and I see some of our NGen folks here today, right? And we have some groups really trying to improve that. But I suspect that going after, rather than the pure invention piece, which we already have a lot of, we have a huge capability in research. The next step, that's scale. How do we achieve scale? How do we connect the right people that need to kind of make that happen, and then get to the cluster you described? And I think that's a role for government.
Okay, we only have 5 minutes left. I can't believe the time has just flown. I'm looking to go to audience questions.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna take one, if that's okay. I guess this is for Kaylee and Todd. We've seen so much offshoring of manufacturing jobs over the years, and I'm curious, for Kaylee, how has that actually impacted membership in unions? Because I think the composition of union membership has changed dramatically over the years, and I would have imagined that manufacturing jobs would have been a very important, large piece of the puzzle, and maybe possibly a higher wage piece of the puzzle within the union membership. And sort of the flip side question that I have for Todd is, are there opportunities here? I've heard, I don't know if it was from you, but it was definitely somebody from Magna saying it's so challenging to bring young people into this industry because people have this image of manufacturing as being very old school and, sorry, friends over here, not very sexy. And so is there a way to kind of leverage new technology, to Ajung's point, to get new people into the mix? And how might that maybe change union membership?
Stars are.
Sure. Exactly how union membership has changed as a result of offshoring, I can't say, we have % less members as a result, but we certainly have less manufacturing jobs in Canada as a result. And one of many policies of our organization is reshoring and bringing back that work. We also understand that if we're bringing back that work, it's going to be a lot of greenfield investment, and then that comes with all sorts of technology that didn't exist 40, 50 years ago when we were building the last round of industrial capacity. So in that way, we could see union growth, union membership growth, and job growth. We do also have a ton of our members work in non-manufacturing areas that are also considered for automation all the time. Nurses, healthcare professionals, we talked about customer service specialists. I'm forgetting hundreds of jobs that I could add to that list. But it's not just the manufacturing sector, of course, well, cleaners, we heard about cleaners this morning, and thinking about then how to have those conversations. And also we heard from the cleaners, I can't remember the name of the company, I'm so sorry, that the folks who were doing the cleaning before didn't get laid off. They were now just doing different jobs to keep the space actually cleaner than it used to be. So I would say that's a win if that conversation is happening. And also, just to reiterate that what we're asking for is manufacturing reshoring that then builds and grows the sector so that there's more capacity and we're seeing economic growth, more jobs, all those sorts of things.
Answer.
Yeah, sure. I'll just add on top. Technology. Yeah, I think we're doing a better job than we were, but there's still a ton of room to bringing younger people awareness of the level of technology, sort of the excitement we have in our sectors. And I'll speak for automotive, but I think it applies to others. We could do much better than, we're kind of in the financial capital right now, but selfishly I look at this and I say, how can I get some of that talent coming into our world? And that's about getting people interested and excited and realize. And when I engage, and my team engages with students at universities specifically, and you actually start telling them stories about what you're doing and what it does, the problem tends to solve itself. So I think it's a lot on us to kind of do that.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
Sorry. We just had a conversation in our skilled trade sector about the need to raise awareness in high schools of the exciting jobs that are available in skilled trades. And there's all sorts of different skilled trades. And one thing that was like an aha moment for everyone that really shouldn't have been is that there's a really high turnover in high school students because every 4 years it's a whole new crop. And that's what we want. But it means that that work doesn't finish. It is constantly happening. So, and there's a new crop of guidance counselors, there's a new crop of teachers, all need to be constantly having the conversation about the exciting careers that are available.
And I find they don't tend to know. I don't know if you guys experience this in the schools. At First Robotics, wherever you are, you guys do a great job there, but generally what I see and my kids are younger, right? The education system, they have no idea.
Is there time for one more audience question? There's somebody here with a question.
Yeah, a really quick one, and then I'll just encourage everybody because we have roundtables this afternoon coming up where you will have plenty more opportunity to engage. So last quick question.
Often the narrative that I've heard is that, robots aren't going to actually replace workers because workers will be operating. One of the narratives I've often heard is that robots won't replace workers because workers will be operating the robots or moving into more satisfying roles in the office. I guess with the rise of autonomy and AI, the use of AMRs, pick-and-place robots on factory floors, fleet management software, a lot of this stuff is entirely autonomous. And so doesn't that inevitably lean toward the loss of jobs on really a massive scale? And if so, how do we go about a sea change in attracting young people to the robotics and engineering and R&D fields?
Okay, I'll start with the first part. Look, we've always been We haven't seen necessarily a decrease in employment in our sector, even though we double productivity every so often, right? We have to, or we lose the jobs to overseas. So historically, right, that's something we've always dealt with. Maybe it's going a little bit faster now. The trick is to be ahead of it so that you're gaining more than you're losing, and it sort of we build that over time, and that's the constant race we're in our world, right? The point about, and I think it's, you're not going to train everybody to be a software developer. You probably shouldn't train everybody to be a software developer, and that's fine. There's tons of other roles that are maybe, again, this thinking about robotics and automation as a tool. How do I use that to make someone's job easier so they're more productive? Doesn't mean they have to be a programmer, right?
Well, on that note, I'm going to thank our panelists and especially our moderator today. Rita, thank you so much for guiding this discussion. Really appreciated. Many of the topics that you raised can actually be picked up again in the roundtables. We have one about engaging youth, and we have another about engaging with unions.